I would urge everybody to look towards the tide for like a lesson that nature can teach us. Have you ever noticed when a tide turns? It's very forceful, it's very purposeful. And if you see how water crashes against the shore, right, when the tide turns and comes bounding back to the shore, and if you observe how it behaves when it's met with that obstacle of rocks, it flows over it, it flows under it, it flows around it, it finds crevices and kinds of makes its way through. And that's what stays with me a lot. I mean, I know it's a bit tad too philosophical, but I find that water makes its way, right? When it's faced with an obstacle, it makes its way. And through this action, it changes coastlines and ultimately shapes an entire ecosystem. It decides what it wants to leave through this endless action, and it also decides what it wants to erode away. And again, with this action, it shapes coastlines. Not immediately, it's patient. Over years and years and years, it makes its way. I find that oddly reassuring. Like, I find the tide fluid, but it's also solid in the sense that it's reliable. You can't stop the tide from turning, it's going to keep coming in. That endless cycle of impermanence that you see on the coast, which kind of breaks down creatures' houses, they build it up again, breaks it down again, builds it up again. It's an endless cycle, which in itself is oddly reassuring. It's a harsh space. I mean, I'd find it very difficult to live in a place like that. But I think that is probably a really big learning, and something that I'd like to, after these 4 years of, working so closely with that space, I think that image is very powerful of the tide coming in. It also, when it comes in, it's a clean slate, kind of second chances, new beginnings. And they always say, go with the flow. And perhaps that's not half bad advice.
Welcome to The Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Matthews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from forest soundscapes to fragile oceans, and from the songs of whales and trees to the secret world of microspecies and microbes. In part 2 of this episode, we continue exploring relationality when it comes to water with our 3 guests. Tasneem Khan, a biologist, photographer, adventurer and educator, Divya Panicker, an oceanographer, and Sejal Mehta, who recently wrote a book entitled Superpowers on the Shore. In this part, we go deeper into questions about how water has shaped them and how they have shaped their relations with water. Here we ask them questions about the things that fascinate them about water, evocative and special memories, and stories, myths, and legends that they would like to share. I loved hearing from them all, especially their personal recollections, telling us more about underwater acoustics, bioluminescence, and how sound and light and water combine to form such magnificent sensory experiences and can reach so deeply into our psyches. Before starting off, I would like to mention that the voiceover at the outset was that of Sejal Mehta, who spoke so beautifully of the lessons we can learn from the tides. I will now guide you through some of the narratives and stories they share with us. To start with, I asked Divya, Sejal and Tasneem what they found fascinating about water. Here's what they said, starting with Divya.
What fascinates me about it, I just find it cool how this odorless and almost colorless liquid can be so amenable in some ways. It mixes with so many different substances easily, dissolves so many substances. But in other ways, it's also so powerful and defining. Like, how across long timescales you can see how a river has carved out a canyon. It's just so powerful in the way it defines certain structures.
Now from Tasneem.
Something about water that continues to fascinate me, and it's a fascination that only keeps growing, is around how water shapes and sculpts everything that it comes in contact, both literally and metaphorically. The overlapping edges, rocky coasts, freshwater swamps, even the mangrove forests, sea gypsy settlements, the hulls of boats, shifting sandbanks. It's really endless. And that edge and overlap is always such a dramatic universe in itself.
And finally, Sejal.
Well, one is its absolute vastness. I mean, the way it can swallow everything, the way it has worlds inside it that we might never ever have access to. I mean, I realize that there are parts of this planet that humans will never be able to teach. But those are like, they seem inaccessible, far away. Like sometimes we look at the ocean, I'm standing at the water's edge, and I know that there are parts to this thing that I can see with my own eyes, I can see the ocean, but I know that there are depths that we will never be able to access perhaps. And that is glorious and also unfathomable. So, a marine biologist who works with me, Abhishek Jamalabad, he once told me, well, 1,000 meters below sea level, sunlight stops kind of making a dent, doesn't reach very far below that. And I said, okay, that's a fact. But then he said, do you know what that means? It means that there is a certain depth after which there is an entire civilization that exists that has no knowledge about the sun. They don't know that there is this complete human life forms that live, or human and animal life, plant life, that survive only because of the existence of a sun. And they have no idea. And we share the same planet. And that itself is such a mind blowing fact that there are parts of the ocean that will forever probably remain completely inaccessible. And God only knows what lives down there. And to me, that is very, very fascinating. The other thing is how it can be so many different things, how it can be darkness and light, shallow at areas, deep at some. It can be calm at times, it can be stormy. It's a habitat, and to an entire species, it is completely inhospitable. Like we have to carry our own oxygen if we want to go. And also how ancient it is. And yet, even despite having been around for like millions and millions of years, yet how absolutely relatable and comforting it can be. It just is amazing to me how one thing can be so many different things.
In this next section, I ask all three of them about some of their most striking sensory and other evocative memories around water. Let's hear from Tasneem first. And let's start with some lovely audio Tasneem sent us of waves on the shore and what it sounds like scuba diving underwater.
Having constantly worked pretty hard towards positioning myself within a breath of the sea and spending extended durations of time observing all things water related, I've been quite fortunate to have experienced some pretty remarkable moments, being suspended beneath the water's surface with blue whales, with a massive water column of some 5,000 meters below us, swimming with sperm whales, swimming with oceanic mantas, the absolute magic of a solitary volcano out at sea, both from above and below, waking and sleeping to these infinite horizons out on boats. But while one might often assume that it's these highlights in the extended timeline of exploration that would stand out, for me, it is, in fact, some of the much smaller and less dramatic events that have carved out these lasting memories of water. So for me, I'd say one of my favorite memories of water is what I would call the shallow water chime. And I remember distinctly the first time it was pointed out to me, the sound of water against sand, and that it's distinct for every beach. So I remember floating on my back in shallow waters just beyond the waves and the swell, with ears submerged and holding my breath so you can listen to every sound. And as your ears tune in, you start to detect something similar to a wind chime, but it's created by water jostling grains of sand. And that's the day I learned that every bay has its unique song. And that depends on the type of sand, but also the type of movement in the water. And I will still to date do that at every new beach I visit. Just float for a while and listen for that sound specifically.
And sometimes memories are connected to places that we love to return to. Hear Tasneem talk about the Andamans.
I spent 14 years exploring the Andaman Sea from various different coastal access points, using different kinds of boats and different tools of exploration, but most importantly, with an incredible range of what I would call true field experts who knew those waters like the back of their hands. And it's something about that space, its underwater mountain chain, the dramatic bathymetry that it presents, even the seasonal shifts that you see, and how that affects the creatures and the cultures that depend on it and the lands that it connects to each other. That sea will always feel like home to me, and I think it's the one place that I will keep returning to and will always find something new and captivating to go back for.
Now let's hear Divya recount a memory of swimming in the Maldives, looking for hammerhead sharks early one morning.
So, a couple of years ago, my husband and I went diving in southern Maldives. This is an area especially known for sharks. And generally, diving is associated with colorful reefs, many kinds of fish and other creatures, etc. But a group of us planned a dive away from the reef in the deeper blue waters at dawn, in the hope that we may come across some hammerhead sharks. So we were told that early morning, just as the first rays of the sun hits the water, when it's still fairly cold, at around 30 meters or so, is a good place and time to see them, especially of this particular island in southern Maldives. So we hope to catch a glimpse of these huge sharks. We jumped in, and since there was no reef, it was just a huge expanse of blue. It was very difficult to judge distance, and the only reference we had were our fellow divers. Usually you hear a lot of sound when you're diving on the reef. You hear the crackling of snapping shrimp, and generally you hear a lot more sound. Away from the reef in this deep blue, we heard almost nothing except our bubbles. Anything massive could have passed by behind, beneath, away from our line of sight. We could have just missed it. So it's like this feeling where you feel like the blue has totally enveloped you, but you also know you can see really far out as the water is very clear. It was just so beautiful to see the first rays of suns hitting the water and dappling through. And we were all swimming, trying to find our way back to the reef. So in this deep blue, we were trying to find some sign of a reef and of land. And it just felt really eerie and beautiful and also calming in some sense. Of course, we didn't see any hammerheads and nothing loud or dramatic happened on this dive. But somehow that image of the blue, that feeling and the silence is really stuck in my memory. And I feel like I'll never forget that experience.
Sejal speaks about her memories and the monsoon.
When I was a child, during the legendary Mumbai monsoons, while the rest of the world scurried indoors, my father took me to the beach in June. Sometimes it was just me, sometimes it was an entire gang of cousins. And we'd go into the water and we'd stand either ankle high, waist high, as was safe. And we all used to hold hands and form a human chain against the massive, massive waves that used to crash at us. Along with this, the rain, the monsoon, which was, of course, very, very affronted by this motley crew who had dared to step out during the deluge, would pelt on us. Like it would pelt with renewed vigor as a challenge. And we would all, I remember, laughing. We would be holding our stomachs and laughing. We would lose our chappals to the ocean. And that remains one of my strongest memories of the beach. I lost my father to a fatal heart attack a few years after that. And I remember, one of the things I remember from that time is how my hand would fit into his, and that reassuring, squeeze of his hand, how it made me feel very, very safe. My father always said, if you ever find yourself lost in Mumbai, just align yourself to the ocean and it'll be easier to find your way back. And I never forgot this. Long after his death, as I grew up and become a journalist, a travel writer, on all my travels, wherever I was, I realized that I would always immediately map the closest water bodies in my mind. I'd make a map of it from where I stay, where I travel, where I commute to, and kind of always align myself to the water bodies around where I was. And I think it's a great way to actually familiarize yourself with a new place. And that's a lesson that I always carried with me.
Not all memories are pleasant and some evoke fear. In this next section, Divya speaks about diving and her experiences with it.
I feared diving greatly. I loved being in water, the feeling of weightlessness, moving through the water, and all that. However, I never felt at ease. I was terrified of water currents sweeping me away and being lost out at sea. I was just scared of how powerful water can be at times, how strong a current can be, how powerless you would feel in that situation. So every time I would go out for a dive, before jumping in, my heart would start pounding because I wouldn't know what the water condition underneath would be like. And if the water was calm when I went underwater, I would also calm down immediately. But if a current was discernible to me, I would tense up and I wouldn't relax. I couldn't relax. I would always be testing if I can swim or what I need to do, where everybody else is. But the thing was, I really enjoyed being underwater. And I really enjoyed watching fish, watching the reef, and spending time. So I really also wanted to overcome this fear. And I feel I have been successful by, actually diving more frequently. So I took a drift diving course. I did some work while diving underwater. I started diving in more challenging conditions with stronger currents. And I'm thankful to say it has gotten easier. I am less scared. Interestingly, more than the skills I learned, I feel the ease that I feel comes from learning. I feel somewhere I've learned how to let go and really allowing the current to take me with it. There's also a sense of calm in that situation, but a thrill that comes through that's very difficult to explain. So yeah, that has been my experience.
In this section, we will cover a few different things. Let's delve a little bit more into sound and water. Sejal talks about acoustic camouflage, and Divya speaks more about underwater acoustics.
Water has a way of making us feel safe. Water falling from the sky, the sound of rain, water skipping down a mountain, crashing into a valley, waterfalls, the roar of the ocean, water flowing in a stream. So many people use the sound of the ocean to put them to sleep. And I think it's a really largely non threatening, sort of continuous sound that puts us at ease. It's also something that scientists call acoustic camouflage, where it can sort of drown out the sounds that might actually get us tense. And the sound of water is one of those sounds. There was a study that was done by Professor Buxton, an associate professor of behavioral health at Pennsylvania State University. And the study aimed to facilitate care for patients of acoustic assault. Now, the thing is, our brains are wired to react to sudden sounds like screams or piercing alarms. So, the kind of sound that flowing water provides, that kind of helps with the stress response. So, according to a quote in Life Science, Buxton said, "These slow whooshing noises are the sounds of non threats, which is why they work to calm people. It's like they're saying, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry."
Now, Divya on underwater acoustics. Many thanks to Divya for sharing some of her underwater recordings, which we will start with.
So I am going to talk a little bit more on underwater acoustics, as you were asking, Susan. So sound propagates faster and further in water than air. And this property has made the use of sound to study the underwater world very effective. So, for example, we use echo sounders where we send pings into the ocean and wait for its echoes. And based on the time and strength of the echo we hear, we can form an image of underwater surroundings and say the seafloor substrate, and also get an idea of distances to objects. So it kind of makes an acoustic picture of the underwater world. This, for example, helps ships avoid shallow water areas. It allows us to find fish schools in the ocean. It allows us to map the seafloor, map underwater mountain ranges, etc. All this falls under the realm of active acoustics, where we actively make a sound to study the ocean. Apart from this, we can also use passive acoustics, where we are eavesdropping on what sounds already exist in the ocean. Many animals take advantage of the fantastic propagation properties of sound underwater and use this medium to communicate. So a lot of my study comes under this umbrella. So for example, dolphins use echolocation, which are basically natural sonars, similar works like the echo sounder, and they use this to find fish in the ocean. And whales sing songs in very low frequency bands that can be heard over very large distances. Ships also make sounds in these low frequency bands. So, one active area of research is trying to understand how anthropogenic noise, such as increased shipping, is changing whale and dolphin or other marine animal behavior in several parts of the ocean. So, the study of bioacoustics is allowing us to perceive this underwater world in a very different way from how we used to study in terms of visual or chemical methods. And it really gives us a better understanding of how animals are perceiving their environment sonically. So, for example, on land, like when we hear the sound of thunder, we anticipate that rain may be coming. So, we are now just starting to learn how marine species could be perceiving different geophonic processes in the ocean through sound and what it means in terms of how they behave or occur in certain places. It's a very fascinating area of research, which is still very nascent and complex because the acoustic world underwater is very rich and there's so many parameters in terms of sound propagation and water characteristics that we need to account for. However, this is a very important area of research given the changing climate, which are also changing the dominant sonic signatures in ecosystems. And it's going to be very interesting to look at how these animals which survive using components of the soundscape adapt to these changing sonic worlds as our climate also changes.
I also asked our guests about any stories, myths, and legends around water to wrap up this episode. Let's first hear from Sejal.
What I've actually found is the real life stories of the creatures of the marine realm are much more bizarre than anything that folks, myths, and legends could ever, like, they can't compete. Like the way a cone snail hunts, or the way a sea slug can literally throw out its head, part of its head, like a net, and capture its prey. It's all their regeneration capacities, and I think more than folklore, I think their real life abilities are like, even far. They're actually quite mind blowing. But I do remember when I was writing about cephalopods, I remember immediately relating to a lot of things that were actually written about them, because even in pop culture, when you think about octopuses or squids or cuttlefish, I think there's like a real alien quality that is kind of assigned to them, which scientists don't always approve of. I mean, they think if it's found on this earth, it's not otherworldly. But I think even before pop culture did this, and pop culture has done it, like if you think about, the creatures in Arrival, that movie, or Futurama, or, Captain Davy Jones, even Stranger Things. I think there's a lot of like cephalopod vibes in a lot of these things. But I feel even before pop culture did this, they had lent themselves to myths and legends. And basically, in the 1800s, early 1800s, a crew of a boat off the African coast spotted a giant squid in the ocean. And they described it as a gigantic sea serpent, like a monster from the abyss. And later on, there's a piece in the Smithsonian which actually documents this and talks about it as part of a larger story. And they actually remember that the incident was described as the beast was unlike anything the sailors had seen before. News of the encounter hit the British newspaper The Times 2 months later, telling of the ship's brush with a nearly 100-foot monster that possessed a maw full of large, jagged teeth. And among such other encounters, in a newspaper account in the 1900s, a creature as large as 35 feet caught the attention of scientists in Germany. And it was interesting because, the whole idea of sea monsters and legends, I think also was done by this book that came out around that time, Victor Hugo's terrifying portrayal, of course very inaccurate, of the octopuses in his 1866 book called Toilers of the Sea, where octopuses were like shown as these creatures with gigantic tentacles which evilly drowned humans and boats in the ocean, and they caused larger, like generally caused a lot of mayhem. And it was interesting that around the time in the early 1900s, when these more and more of these sightings were reported, it is so surprising that a worldview was sort of taking shape, that two different worldviews had begun to collide. One was a belief in myths and legends, versus a scientific view that had begun to spread in the third of the 19th century. And people were discovering that the ocean is a three-dimensional space, which, contrary to traditional beliefs, was filled with living organisms far into the depths. So basically, at some point, it seems really funny to me today. We are so research paper oriented and we are constantly checking our facts. That there was a time when people were saying, perhaps this place is not full of demons and monsters, but maybe there are animals that live here. And I think that is like wildly fascinating.
And finally, to conclude, Tasneem takes us through a light show with her exploration of bioluminescence and the very interesting origin of words.
When we think about light, we often associate it with heat or fire or the sun. But I'm always taken by this mysterious or supernatural fascination across history and cultures that has been associated with bioluminescence. And that's because it's this unexplained, cool, and enigmatic light. It's different to any light we know or understand. And even now, after having studied it and being quite aware as to what creates this bioluminescence in the sea, I have found myself rushing out onto the deck early in the morning, just in that magic quarter hour before there's too much ambient light in the sky, sort of lying there, hanging off the back, waiting for my eyes to spot that first luminous turquoise twinkle. And once you spot the first one, it's quite incredible how your eyes adjust, and it almost appears like this inverted rain coming up from the depths of these little capsules of light. And these are what we call sea fireflies or ostracods, and that's just one kind of bioluminescence. But it's like many aspects of science. Most of the early descriptions of bioluminescence were from ship logs. And reading these and researching them is most fascinating because the descriptions are almost poetic and so steeped in mystery. In fact, they go back all the way to 1500 BC. People writing and puzzling over these ribbons of light, specks of light. They've been described as milky shining seas, radiant waves, starry waters. In fact, there's a record around what was then the Siam Sea, describing them as luminous spirits. So it's quite remarkable to read and decipher what their observations might have been and what they were actually witnessing. If I'm not mistaken, in fact, even Aristotle has described bioluminescence as exhalations of fire from the sea. So you see this repeated again across cultures, across oceans, and across anyone who has ventured out onto the water for an extended duration of time. I love how this is still visible both across science and mythology, and that constant back and forth between fact and fiction, even in the name, because bioluminescence occurs essentially when light is released through a chemical reaction. And in that case, there are generally two things involved. It's an enzyme, luciferase, and a pigment, luciferin. So these terms, luciferase and luciferin, are also derived from the Latin term lucimfere, and that means light bearer. So if you think about the folklore figure Lucifer, it it actually stemmed from this same meaning, which at the time would have meant light bringing. And it's interesting how that has morphed into what then became the defiant angel, or the devil, or prince of darkness. And I just find this back and forth across marine related wonder and mystery, and how that figures across cultures and stories in the sciences, in philosophy, and in mythology. Absolutely captivating.
Thanks to our three guests for sharing their thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.